Hi, my name is Justin McDaniel. I'm a professor of Southeast Asian Studies and Buddhist Studies at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And I have lived and worked in Southeast Asia for many years, including Burma, Thailand, and Laos, and Cambodia. Spent some time in India as well. I have had the great privilege of working with many Burmese scholars and Burmese nuns and monks over the years, and interacting with them, and also in my expertise in Thailand as well. And so, although I am a specialist when it comes to the Shan people of Burma, and when it comes to Buddhism in general in Southeast Asia, today I'd like to talk a little bit about the political history and colonial history of Burma, to give students, as you're debating in the Model UN, a better understanding of the historical issues and the historical precedents for a lot of things you're understanding today. Because generally when we read in the UN, we read debates about policy, and we read kind of impassioned letters from Burmese protesters and human rights activists, and we read the horrible stories of the abuses of the Burmese government. We can learn a great deal about policy, we can learn a great deal about political science and power and economics in the modern world, and the effectiveness of the UN or the ineffectiveness often of the UN. However, many policymakers have a very minimal understanding of the deep history of a lot of these problems. And so today I want to, in my role as a consultant, talk about a little bit about these histories. So any time we have in the study of Burma, international policymakers attempt to understand the Burma issue, they run up against a brick wall. The Burmese people have been victimized by an oppressive and xenophobic military regime for well over 40 years. Minorities like the Shan, the Arakanese, the Wa, the Kachin, and the Gadian, or often called the Karen people, have terrible abuses to them. They're denied basic human rights, political representation, economic kind of development, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of the internet access. Political assemblies are squashed. Peaceful protesters have been attacked violently by soldiers. Opposition leaders are marginalized politically, or they're killed, or they're imprisoned. There are very few avenues of economic advancement. Foreign aid barely gets through. Cultural expression is curtailed by censor boards. And unfortunately, governments like the US, China, Britain, Australia, Japan, Germany, India, Canada, as well as the UN, have not done enough to kind of take away the oppression of people in Burma, and have done very little in terms of active policy work to help the Burmese. And why is this? Well, there's several reasons of this, and I'm sure that you have studied these reasons. The blocking of the Chinese government of intervention in Burma, the unwillingness of the Chinese to kind of enforce embargoes on timber and oil, and the gem trade, the illegal gem trading that goes on across the Thai border, the illegal opium and heroin trading that goes on between India, China, Thailand, and parts of Laos. The unwillingness of the Indian and Chinese government to put true kind of economic pressure on the Burmese government, the unwillingness of the U.S. To make Burma kind of a policy priority for international politics. There are a lot of problems, and also another problem is that when we do enforce kind of economic sanctions, when we do enforce or attempt to enforce economic embargoes and in various governments, is that who is it really helping and who is it really hurting? And it usually is helping the non-elite Burmese. It's the small business people, it's students, it's the poor who get hurt in Burma, not the elite of the country, the military elite, who are wealthy enough to sustain their power despite economic sanctions and being isolated. So let's talk so specific now about history, and talk about how we can deal with the historical problems of Burma, and deal with the military government in Burma in a constructive way. And perhaps explain some of the frustration we've had about why the Burmese government is not responding to overtures, either negative kind of punishment overtures or positive kind of opening up and economic benefit overtures from places like the U.S. and places like Thailand and other places, and why we can help perhaps ask, why is the Burmese government still maintaining their power, still maintaining their harsh rule, despite massive kind of international outcries, not international policy changes, of course, theirs have been slow in coming, but international outcries is that how can a government purposely, over so many years, oppress other people politically, oppress their people economically, and culturally? Why don't the wealthier, older generation of the Burmese government, why don't they simply take the money and run, to put it in a blunt way? Why do they hold on to power when they simply could allow freedoms in their countries, and still it wouldn't hurt their wealth, it still wouldn't hurt their power? They would have plenty of resources to maintain themselves and the family. Why do they try to hold on to power in the face of overwhelming kind of international outcries and popular outcries in Burma? Why haven't they gone down, why hasn't the Burmese government gone down the road of, say, Thailand or India and developed relatively strong and stable democratic institutions? Why haven't they allowed real opposition political parties to run? Why haven't they tried to increase or improve their standing in the world, their moral standing in the world, so to increase simple things like tourist money, to increase things like money for research and development that would flow into Burma if the Burmese allowed? Why have this small group of elderly military men chosen the life of power over the life of compassion and openness to the rest of the world? Now, there are no real kind of easy answer to it. Sometimes, simplistic answers are offered by historians or political scientists that, well, it's simply that people in political power don't want to give up political power, that absolute power corrupts absolutely, or they give simplistic policy answers that if only China would change its policy, everything in Burma will work out, or if only North Korea didn't support the Burmese government, or the Thai government put pressure on them, or the American government put pressure, that everything would work out well, is that we just have to make some simple policy shifts, or that if we better supported grassroots protests and grassroots movements in Burma, is that Burma would change from the inside. And these policy have not worked. These policies are not going forward. We don't have pressure coming in the UN to change things in Burma. And I think we need to understand that in order for policy to work, is that we have to understand, or at least try to step in the mentality of the so-called enemy, or understand the so-called enemy if the enemy is the military dictatorship of Burma, and kind of understand the legacy of dictatorships in Burma, and understand the legacy of xenophobia and the legacy of foreign intervention in Burma or Myanmar today. And I'll generally say Burma and not Myanmar, even though the name of the country is officially Myanmar. So, Burma has had a long history. Let's step back in history. Burma's had a long history of oppression. They've had a long history of dictatorships. They've had a long history of authoritarian rule. Except for a very, very brief period in the 1950s, really. Burma has always been ruled by a military dictatorship, whether we call that a royal absolute monarchy, or we call it a colonial power, military colonial power under the British, or we call it the present military government in Myanmar or Burma, is that there hasn't been much historical experience in Burma for democracy. There hasn't been much historical experience for the understanding that a government is supposed to share power with its people, or a government is decided by the will of the populace, or the will of the majority. Is that it's not something that can be easily transferred to Burma because Burma has no experience with it. Therefore, the government in Burma generally sees talk about democracy and basic human rights as something foreign to being Burmese, as something foreign to the Burma experience. And so if it is something that is foreign, it is something that needs to be mistrusted. And we also have to understand, and I'll explain in a few minutes, or list kind of the details of this, is that Burma, generally in the past, political change of either one king to another king, one dynasty to another dynasty, one government to another dynasty, has been caused generally because of foreign invasion. That we don't have kind of peaceful political change happening within the country from internal will. Is that we don't have policy that develops change within the country, a real change. Is that change generally in political power has come because of outside invasion or outside pressure. And I don't necessarily mean outside in terms of other countries, although that's certainly the case, but actually outside in terms of outside ethnic groups within the country, because Burma is a very diverse ethnic place. And so, generally, Burmese governments have been very wary of outside powers, because outside powers have generally invaded and changed and deposed people in power. So it is very difficult not only to talk about democracy, because there's not a lot of experience of democracy, and very difficult to talk about change coming from pressure from the outside, because outside is always seen a place that deposes power, not a place that helps enhance or change things peacefully in a country. Burma has been a place that has been crisscrossed by many different ethnic groups, many different foreign military powers over the past. And unity in Burma, traditionally, since at least as far back as we can go on records, and since the early days of Burmese history, but I'll really talk about really post-11th century, political power, when there has been peaceful political rule in Burma, it is always through an iron hand. It is always through very strong, centralized leadership in the country. And so this centralized leadership and the power of the core is seen as essential to maintaining peace. And democracy or diversity or having multiple voices in a pluralistic society that we might value in places like Europe and the United States or in India, this idea is that diversity is a strength, or diversity and kind of diffusing power to democracy is a strength, is something that is simply not understood in the Burmese experience. Strength and peace comes from centrality and authoritarian power. Multiple voices lead to multiple kind of disagreements and lead to internal conflict, and it lead to civil war. And democracy is seen as something that would either break up the country into many different ethnic groups, Shan, Arakanese, Wa, Kachin, Garian, Mon, is that the country would break up if there isn't democracy because there's too much ethnic difference in the country, or democracy would lead to out-and-out civil war and violence. Let me start with a little bit of historical background. The earliest evidence that we have of power in central Burma are the Pyu city-states, beginning in about the 6th century. These were royal fiefdoms that eventually consolidated to some larger-scale kingdoms, based on the idea that king was divine and that he was the protector of the people, and he was a protector of especially of the Satsana, or the religion. Satsana or Tatana in Burmese means religion. The religion was usually Theravada Buddhist with mixes of esoteric Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and local animism, although I'm making that extremely complicated religious system a little bit simplistic here. But in general, the government was seen as the protector of the Buddhism in the country, and was protector of the religion, and in a sense protector of the culture. These Pyu kingdoms didn't last for long. They were small fiefdoms in the areas of central Burma, and they were largely their power were largely ended with the invasion of tribes and warring states from southern China. I won't go into that history, but in any case, according to Burmese history and according to inscriptions that we have and descriptions, and in the memory that is taught to Burmese school children today, is that invasions from foreigners from southern China ended the power. And it's also understood that Pyu states in general had centralized power under kings. That these were not democratic societies, of course. It is also understood that the ethnic makeup of many of the Pyu city-states was actually not Burmese speakers, but Mon speakers, and that the Mon slowly gained power in this region and lost power in this region as well, kind of farther south from the Burmese center, overlapping with what was Siam or Thailand at what we call Thailand today. These Mon-speaking areas, different from the Burmese-speaking areas, is that the Mons also lost power in this era from foreign invasion, and that foreign invasion really was Angkorian, or from the empires in Cambodia at that time, coming and rising in the 10th and 11th century, and which pushed the Mon outside of the kind of area of their traditional power, which was in the area of central Thailand today, or the Chao Phraya River Valley, and moved the Mon into parts of southern Burma and eastern Burma today. And there was conflict between Mon and Burmese speakers traditionally at this time, and there still is today. And so Mon were seen as often foreigners in Burmese history, and they're stateless people today who have been in a series of kind of rebellions against the Burmese government. So early Burmese history teaches us two important things. One, that centralized control is important for maintaining order, and second of all, the reason that centralized control ended and region of these kingdoms ended was through two foreign powers, Angkorian powers and southern Chinese powers at the time. And so this is what Burmese children are taught in school, and this is what the Burmese leaders were taught as well when they were being educated locally. The Piu city-states and the Mon people that occupied Burma between the 6th and the 10th, 11th century lost their power to foreign powers, and they are seen as being in conflict with one another. And so the idea is that early on in history, that two ethnic groups and two linguistic groups, the Mon and the Piu, could not necessarily live together without a centralized control. It took kings to a centralized king and centralized control of agriculture, irrigation, and religion to maintain peace. However, this is early history, and we don't know too much about it. But what the area we do know a great deal about because of architectural history, archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, inscriptional or epigraphical evidence we call it, is the early kingdom of Bagan in centralized Burma. And the Bagan kingdom ruled between approximately 1044 and 1287. Okay? This was, many people believe, the first true Burmese kingdom, because in the capital of Bagan, people spoke Burmese, different from modern-day Burmese, but a version of Burmese, and that the first real Burmese king, Anoyata, was the very kind of a very strong and powerful leader of the Bagan kingdom. Now, he became powerful and centralized control by suppressing peoples around him, suppressing the Mon, suppressing the Shan, and other groups like the Garian speakers and tribal groups in the area, and suppressed their individual and independent power through violent military campaigns and through centralizing the capital, claiming that he was a bodhisattva or a Buddhist enlightened being. And he also started a massive construction campaign of hundreds of temples and or often called pagodas and stupas, or funerary kind of structures or mounts, almost like pyramids, you could say, in Bagan. And you can still see these today, these massive structures in Burma today if you visit. And King Anoyatai and his followers in the early Bagan dynasty were strong because they displayed their wealth through construction, and they enslaved lots of people, lots of other ethnic groups to build these things, and they ruled with an iron fist. Again, the Bagan Empire is seen as a glorious time in Burmese history, and one that is lauded by Burmese kings today. And it is seen as the glory of it was ended. Why? Not by internal strife necessarily, and not by peaceful change of power, but by foreign invasion again. And this is by Mongol forces in 1287, were said to have destroyed the Bagan Empire. Over the next 250 years after this, is that it's seen as a very difficult time in Burmese history, a very chaotic time in Burmese history. And it's seen as chaotic because that it was it was a time of ethnic diversity, a time when there was no strong leaders, a time when there were frequent wars between the Arakanese, the Shan, the Burmese people, and other minor kingdoms. And we had many kingdoms at this time that gained power for a little bit of time, like kingdoms centered around the Sagaing Hills, powers that were coming down in areas of Martaban and Mulamyain, areas were independent city kind of states that were developing in what we call Dawei or Tenasserim in previous times, down near the Thai border and the the Andaman Sea. And so there was lots of little powers, but there was frequent wars, frequent oppression, and the kingdom that kind of grew out of this area was the kingdom of Pegu, which was based in the Mon areas. And in the so again, it is not seen as necessarily a rise of Burmese power at this time, chaotic time, but a rise of power in Burma, not connected to ethnic Burmese speakers. Although scholars today disagree about this, and we also question, what does ethnicity mean? What does language different means at the time? Could people have been speaking multiple languages? Is the way we understand ethnicity in the modern world the way ethnicity was understood at that time? But regardless, in the mind of leaders in Burma today, and what is taught in textbook to school children in Burma, again, it is emphasized that chaos is because of diversity. Chaos is because of ethnic conflict, and chaos is because you don't have centralized dictatorial leadership. Is that multiple voices lead to multiple problems in a sense. So, at this chaotic time, there's about 250, 300 years of chaos after Mongol invasions. Not necessarily all of it was chaos, but there was certainly a series of wars and multiple changing of power, and the country of what we call Burma today, or Myanmar today, was not the same. There was multiple centers of power that often were in conflict. At this time, we not only had kind of internal strife, but we also had the rise of self-identity of a lot of what we call minority tribes in Burma today. The Dai Le people, the Dai Kun people, the Shan people, the Dai Yai, the Korean, the Kachin, the Wa, and especially the Arakanese, who really maintained a separate power. And Arakan is in a part of Burma that is near the border of India. I actually have a Burmese map behind me, and it would be in this general area of Burma near India, and then the Shan states would be over in this area. But that map's unclear. But in any case, we have to understand that Burma is a very large place. It's a very difficult place to travel. Lots of hills, lots of valleys, not very good road systems. Certainly at this time there wasn't good road systems and good travel. Rivers are often navigable, and rivers are a good way to get around. But there's many places of Burma that are difficult to get to, like Arakan, like the Shan states, and easier now with planes, but of course at this time they weren't. And so the idea of maintaining a unity over this country, where it's such topographical changes and such ethnic differences and such linguistic differences, it was seen that the only way of ruling something like this, if it could even be ruled at all, was be through kind of a massive administrative centralized control. So the period that is celebrated as ending this warring period in Burmese history is celebrated as a return to this authoritarian rule and a return to the power of a centralized king. And starting in the 1550s, we have the rise of King Bayinyang. And Bayinyang was an extremely influential king in Burmese history. He is honored in Burmese history even today. And he started consolidating his power in the 1550s. And how did he consolidate it? By kind of suppressing ethnic differences and suppressing outlying territories. So from a central power in central Burma today, started to have family members of him, minor princes and kings, including members of his immediate family, leading armies into what we call the area of northern Thailand today, or the Lanna, at that time the Lanna Kingdom, areas around the city of Chiang Mai, areas of the Thai Le and Thai Kun people in Chiang Tung, which would be in part of Burma, and then also the Yunnan area of southern China, and then also over into parts of Arakan, and also deep south into the Mon territories as well. And Bayinyang is honored because of his ability to efficiently collect taxes, efficiently rule outlying areas, have a well-disciplined military, and also a massive use of slave labor that he was bringing in from these outlying areas, the Shan, what we call the Shan states today, northern Thailand, and the areas of southern Burma, the peninsular Burma as well. This kingdom, the dynasty that was started by Yang and then his followers, ruled successfully for many years. They successfully invaded Ayutthaya, which was the capital of what we Siam, or what we call Thailand today. And many slaves were brought in, including, for example, King Naresuan, when he was a young boy of Siam, was enslaved under house arrest in Burma. So the idea of house arrest is like we have with Aung San Suu Kyi today, is part of Burmese history. The idea is that you keep a very close eye on your enemies. And for example, Prince Naresuan lived in a very nice house in a palace in Burma, but his movements were tracked and who he talked to was tracked. So the threat to the empire that was started by Yang was also seen as a foreign threat. So not only were these outlying areas of Shan speakers and Tai Khun speakers and Thai speakers and Arakanese speakers need something you need to press, but who they were dealing with as well. For example, the Arakanese used Portuguese mercenaries. So we had the Portuguese coming in time, and the most popular, the best technology for warfare at the time was Portuguese rifles. We also had Turkish cannons being used in the military at this time. And so, again, this the threats against the what is called the Taungoo dynasty of Burma was the threats that were brought by not only foreign speakers, other ethnic groups, but also foreign weapons and foreign technology. And so the attack on Burma was seen as attack from the outside. And the end of the Taungoo dynasty was seen as not because of the loss of the rise of democracy or popular protests or economic change, but from outside invasion and outside threat. The last of Burma's great kingdoms, and I'm moving through history quite quickly, but I really do want to kind of show what history can teach us, is the Konbaung dynasty, which ruled in Burma from 1752 to 1885, so up to more recent times. Again, this was a military dictatorship, absolute military dictatorship, that violently suppressed opposition of the Arakanese, the Mon, the Shan, the Garian, the Kachin, the Wa, and many other groups, also up in the areas of Manipur, in Assam, which is present-day India today. Not only did they violently suppress opposition and diversity, but they also centralized administrative control by instituting exams, for example, for Buddhist monks, and forcibly disrobing monks that didn't agree or didn't follow the reforms, the royal reforms going on. They set up kind of ranking, formalized ranking of monks and also political leaders. They started to keep kind of extensive records and monitoring the activities of monks and nuns, intellectuals, and local leaders, like Burma does. The Burmese government today keeps very close watch and very close control over its own populace, almost spying on its own people in a sense. These things were not something that was invented in the modern period. This is something that was part of Burmese kingdoms, and especially a trait of the Konbaung dynasty in the late 18th and throughout the 19th century. Now, this very powerful and very wealthy kingdom, a kingdom that successfully invaded Siam and burnt the city of Ayutthaya, a kingdom that successfully ruled all these diverse ethnic areas of what we call modern-day Burma today, the areas that is included in modern Burma today. It was seen as because of the centralized power. But why did it end? It ended again with foreign invasion, and this time with the British, and the British slowly taking over territory and economic rights in Burma, starting in 1824 and going a series of really 3 wars, and ending in 1885 with the British total takeover of Burma as colonial powers. And the British not only ruled militarily, and they ruled through a centralized government, so the Burmese saw that foreign power also was power of absolute. The British didn't have democracy. They didn't bring democracy to Burma. They didn't teach Burmese democracy or representation. They ruled through military force and through economic control. And they ruled through their use of military technology. And there wasn't Burmese representation in government. There wasn't Burmese participation. There wasn't grassroots support. All of these things, the British did not teach freedom. They did not teach democracy. They taught control. And they had efficient collection of taxes. They had efficient marking of certain regions and mapping. They used extensive mapping technologies at the time to fix borders, to kind of signify and control administrative posts, all of these things. So the British were particularly good at centralized power. And this was, and they ruled Burma for a long time, from really 1824, but then say formally after 1885 until World War II, and the Japanese invasion of Burma is starting in 1942. So the Burmese government learned from foreign powers not only to be wary of foreign powers, but that foreign powers stayed in control because of their centralized administrative organization. Also, the British created a distaste in the Burmese government's memory, or the Burmese people's memory, is that many of the administration posts and many of the higher economic posts were actually controlled by Indians that were being brought by British India. And so again, this would cause a lot of resentment among the Burmese people and the Burmese elite at the time, that despite Burmese education systems, despite traditional Burmese power and families that had been in control for a long time, is that these kind of exclusive elite posts were being given to Indians, again to foreigners, is making them wary of outsiders. How did the British power end in Burma? It ended because of Japanese invasion. And so again, another foreign power, another imperial power, another highly technological military force invaded and ended British rule there. And after the chaos of World War II and the defeat of the Japanese, we had the rise of Young Men's Buddhist Association, the Union for Democracy, and various other Burmese political groups that had been kind of fighting against British control, started to gain power and started to have elections after the British left. However, this did not last for long at all, and General Ne Win took over. Really wasn't a bloodless coup. There was bloodshed, but largely a non-violent, well, certainly was violent, but not massive destruction coup starting in the 1950s, and of course in the 1960s. And one of the people who was that the General Ne Win had to, and others in his clique had to eliminate, was Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San, who was, if you want to say there was a kind of democratically elected person in Burmese history, although that's not completely accurate that he's democratically elected. Aung San, he didn't last in power for long, and either did one of his compatriots, U Nu. So Ne Win was seen as restoring peace and restoring order and getting rid of chaos in the 1960s, chaos that was being caused by communists, chaos that was being caused by warring between the Kuomintang forces and the Maoist forces in China that were disrupting areas along the Burmese northern border. Is that Ne Win saved, in a sense, Burma, or that what is claimed by the Burmese government, saved Burma from the chaos of the destruction of a communist regime. And without Ne Win and kind of ruling from centralized power and military control, General Ne Win was able to keep the country intact and not lead it into civil war and ethnic conflict between Shan and Mon and Arakanese and other people. And that his rule is seen as a return to Burmese normalcy, return to Burmese kind of the heritage of great Burmese kings, and not as a person who is strange. Might be seen as a person that is somehow going against history, not allowing democracy to happen, oppressing his people, and of course Ne Win and the follower Ne Win really kind of retired in 1980, but still in power after that, and picked successors, as we know and as you're studying in Burmese policy. I won't go over the things that you obviously are working on now, But that to the U.S. or to students in the U.S. or to people outside observers of Burma, Ne Win's power and Ne Win's control and the suppressing of elections, the suppressing of democracy, the house arrest of Aung San Suu Kyi, the assassination of Aung San, this history of just violent oppression and robbing of human rights might be seen as something dreadful and something as illegal outside of Burma, but in Burmese history, to the Burmese leaders themselves, and to some, perhaps a chunk of the Burmese population as well, as something that is normal for Burmese history. And this is also something that, through kind of pomp and circumstances, through ceremonies, through songs, through the writing of textbooks, is promoted by the Burmese government themselves. So they are teaching this history of power to the next generation, and they have for the last 40 years. And they are teaching that foreigners necessarily bring chaos, they don't bring progress. And so this idea that the UN or the Nobel Peace Prize Committee or that international observers or celebrities who support the Burmese freedom cause and support Aung San Suu Kyi, these are seen not as kind of people who want to bring peace to Burma. These are seen as people who want to take power away from the central Burmese government. And so the recent rebellions in 1988, and then again, of course, in 2007, the Saffron Revolution, in a sense, we might see these as in the light of the history of political protest and grassroots protest and kind of peaceful nonviolence in the history of Martin Luther King and Gandhi. But to many in the Burma elite and the Burmese upper class, these are seen as a sign of chaos and a sign of ethnic strife. And the deep paranoia that has been created by the study or particular view of history of the Burmese government is causing this paranoia and causing the push for democracy, and the outside pressure is causing them to harden their case and causing them to turn inward, and even move the capital in 2005 and really after 2007 established a new capital in outside of Yangon, outside of the kind of commercial and political center of the country that has been for the last 100 or so years. It kind of really rose under the British. They moved to an isolated place in centralized Burma. So again, this idea of retreating away from the periphery and going into the center. And so the killing of monks, the imprisoning of protesters, the suppression of political division is seen as something that is necessary in Burmese history to maintain order in this country. And I'm not going to go into the idea of human rights either, because the human rights is also seen as a foreign concept. It's seen as that people aren't naturally born with a set of rights. And in Buddhist ethics and Buddhist ideas of karma, human rights is not something that is natural. But again, that's a whole other issue. What I hope I have offered you today is just a different perspective, that we have to understand that we have to step into the mindset and the historical background and the shared institutional, political, and emotional history of the Burmese leaders, and not simply see them as anti-democracy and anti-Aung San Suu Kyi and anti-kind of human rights, but see them as believing that they are inheriting a tradition of centralized power and a tradition of centralized control in Burma that has been taught over a century, or not century, many centuries, over millennia. And thank you very much, and good luck in your debates, and hopefully this little bit of historical background will give a little bit of richness to your debates. Thank you very much.